The take-home pay of working South Africans declined on a monthly basis to an average of 15,321 rand. BankservAfrica's take-home pay index says the unexpected rise in inflation number to 7.1% in March led to lower average salaries. The BankservAfrica take-home pay index is calculated on a monthly basis by dividing the total value of salaries paid into the bank accounts of employees. Now, this excludes salaries over 100,000 rand per month. For more on these, we joined by independent economist Elize Kruger. Elize, what are some of the things that are affecting the payments for South Africans?
Matteo, yes, quite a few factors. I mean, the inflation rate is one, and that's specifically impacting on the real side. I mean, if you strip out the impact of inflation, we've seen salaries dropping over the last while, and in March specifically about 4.8% down. But I think it speaks to the broader economic environment that is quite challenging for companies out there. Now, from the ongoing load shedding to high cost of production, high interest rates, the business environment has been very challenging. And that is just not an environment conducive for high salary increases or, for that matter, for aggressive, job creation.
And when we look at inflation, I mean, we often worry about inflation in terms of products and what's happening at the shopping aisle. Are we going to be paying more? But when we look at salaries, how does inflation eat away at our payments?
Absolutely. Inflation is eroding the purchasing power of your money. So if you do not get a salary increase that is above the rate of inflation, that would mean that, the money in your pocket will buy you less products. You will have to look at your budget and see where you can cut, because you can just simply not afford to keep on buying the same products without having a salary increase that kept up with the sort of changes in prices. So that erosion of purchasing power is a very real, reality for South Africans at the moment, especially if you look at the components of CPI that has been increasing even much more than the headline number. For instance, our food price inflation is sitting at 14%. Fuel price inflation is double digits. So, if you have a big portion of your expenditure on those items, even more so, will your money not quite take you where it used to take you.
Well, this particular data from BankServ, the take-home pay index, really looking at the average pay for South Africans at around 15,000 rand. But what about those income categories below that or less than? How are those being affected by inflation?
Well, I would say everybody's affected, but, if you look at the spending basket of the lower income category, that is a very high percentage on food and also a high percentage on your transport component. And both those we've seen increases in excess of the overall inflation rate. So I would say that I think, the lower income category earners are suffering more as opposed to the high income, where the basket of products are a bit more diverse, and the weight is not so high, perhaps on your transport and food particularly.
The index also touching on, Elize, the fact that companies are opting for contract work and less permanent work contracts for workers. This obviously means they're earning less at this particular period. Are companies also starting to feel the increasing pressure from the low economy?
I do think so indeed, Matteo. I think what we've seen in the numbers lately, especially in the last couple of months, that there's quite a bit of volatility in the number of salaries paid. And when you analyze the data into a bit more detail, we found that most of that sort of volatility is in the lower income group. So we've seen, for instance, in January, a big drop in the lower income salaries paid, and now in March, we've seen quite an increase again. So that tells us that, maybe companies are opting more for contract and casual workers, use them where needed, get rid of them again the next month if not needed, quickly, adding again onto the payroll the next month if needed. So we get a sense that there's a lot more volatility in that sector of the economy than what we previously observed.
So given that assessment, then we shouldn't read too much into the fact that 216,000 more salaries were paid in March. Some of those obviously would be those contractual workers.
Indeed so, and if you look at the quarter, meaning incorporating, for instance, the big drop in January, which we did at the time said we reckon it is seasonal of nature, i.e. that, maybe in December a lot of seasonal and casual workers were employed that now fell out of the payroll again in January. So if you incorporate those sort of drops in January, for the quarter as a whole, actually we've got a negative number. So you're indeed correct that, although it's a positive on the day and in the month of March, it's not really the start, I would say, of a sustainable trend in employment creation, not with the economic environment that we've just talked about out there that is quite difficult.
Well, it's a catch-22 for the workers and companies as well. On the other side, workers want inflation-beating salaries. On the other hand, companies want to keep their costs down. So how does one meander this economy if those are the challenges?
That is, as you say, quite a conundrum at the moment. Yes, indeed, I think that's where you need to get to the negotiating table, and where companies will have to play open cards and say, to keep the doors open, to keep into business, we can afford, X% increase, and workers will have to weigh between, potential of maybe job cuts if they cannot afford to give everybody a high increase as opposed to perhaps lower increases and keep your job. So it is a difficult economic environment, I would say, both for companies and for workers at the moment.
This particular study doesn't only look at salaries, there's also the pension side of things, the people that have now retired. What are you seeing in terms of those numbers?
There's a bit of positivity on the pension front, Mateo, and that's quite an interesting, observation that the banks of data has over time, actually, not only now, but in the past couple of years, we've already picked up this trend that pension payments actually kept up better with inflation as opposed to the take-home pay in terms of the salary payment. So from that point of view, if you look at it in nominal terms, I think for this month it was up 6.7%. Yes, inflation was maybe in the month 7.1%, but if you look at it on average, we have found that in nominal terms, that indeed pensions have kept up. So in real terms, it's almost flat, but that indicates to you that it has kept up with inflation. So one could then say that, pensioners are slightly better off, although remember that they only get a pension that is maybe 65% of the total value of a salary. So it's not as if a pensioner can go out and be on a spending spree. As it is, they receive a lesser amount for pension as opposed to a salary. But indeed, if you are used to be able to afford a certain basket, one could then argue that on average, pensioners could continue to afford that.
And how can consumers, prepare themselves for pensions? You're saying that salaries are low at this moment, and if they remain persistent, it would be tough economically for the consumer. So how do you make sure that your pension payments are up to date as well?
Yes, that is indeed a challenge to, keep on paying and keep on saving in such a difficult economic environment. But wherever possible, we should all, put some money away for our old age. And if you can do that via your company, that would be first prize. But if you work for yourself or if you're maybe an informal worker, the challenge is bigger to still put some money away.
Your assessment then of South Africa's economy going forward, all the numbers indicating that we are likely to go into a recession, even though the finance minister doesn't think we're going to get two negative quarters of growth. Your assessment of 2023 economically for South Africa?
Yes, we are in a very difficult economic scenario. I would say, will we be negative in quarter one? Perhaps not. My own figures are still showing a small positive number quarter on quarter. But I almost want to say, that is sort of the technical side of it. If you look at the economy as a whole, it is really recessionary environment that we look at. There's a lot of people that want to work that do not have opportunities to work. High unemployment rate. We see really a lot of sectors either in negative territory or just marginal growth rates, not enough to thrive, not enough to invest, not enough to appoint people. So the economy is really in a very low growth trap at the moment when we all know how load shedding is keeping us back. So I think this year is going to be particularly difficult, but hopefully if we look into next year and the year thereafter, if we can start to see some of the projects that have been started to be built and will be commissioned, in the next 12 to 18 months, could perhaps, just alleviate the power pressures enough to get the economy going a bit. But this particular year, I think we're going to struggle to keep our heads above water. It's going to be a difficult year for all.
Look, Elize, it's really been a struggle for all consumers. Elize Kruger, the independent economist, giving us some grim numbers for consumers in South Africa going into 2023.